In this episode, we're going to demystify sampling and evidence so you can approach them like a calm, methodical QSA instead of feeling like you are guessing or trying to satisfy someone's personal preference. Sampling is one of those words that can sound intimidating because it implies you will not look at everything. And beginners often worry that if you do not look at everything, you are taking a risk. The truth is that assessments exist in the real world, and the real world has limits. So sampling is a practical necessity, not a shortcut. What makes sampling safe and defensible is how you do it and how you connect it to evidence that truly supports your conclusions. Evidence strategies are about choosing proof that is strong enough, representative enough, and clear enough that a reviewer could follow your logic and reach the same conclusion. By the end, you should understand what smart sampling means, what bulletproof evidence feels like, and how to avoid the most common mistakes that make assessments fragile. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first step is understanding why sampling exists at all, because it is easy to see it as a compliance trick when you are new. In a complex environment, there may be hundreds of systems, thousands of accounts, and countless configurations, and it is not realistic to inspect every single detail in a limited assessment window. Sampling is the method for selecting a subset that can reasonably represent the whole when the environment is consistent and controlled. The key phrase there is consistent and controlled, because sampling only works when the thing you are sampling from behaves the same across the population. If every server is built from the same hardened image and managed through the same process, then checking a subset can provide confidence about the rest. If every site follows the same point of sale build and the same policies, sampling can be defensible. But if environments vary widely, sampling becomes risky because your subset may not represent the reality. So sampling is not just a mathematical idea. It is a maturity check on standardization and governance. A smart QSA uses sampling as a tool when it fits and avoids it when it does not. Now, let's define what evidence means in this world, because evidence is the foundation of every defensible conclusion. Evidence is anything that demonstrates a claim is true, and in assessments it often comes from three broad sources: what people say, what documents show, and what you can observe or verify in the environment. Interviews are valuable because they reveal processes and intent, but interviews alone are weak evidence because people can be mistaken or incomplete. Documentation is valuable because it shows formal expectations and records, but documents alone can be outdated or not followed. Observation and technical artifacts are valuable because they show what is actually happening, but even they can be misunderstood if you do not know the context. Bulletproof evidence strategies combine these sources, so the weaknesses of one are covered by the strengths of another. For example, a policy says a process exists, an interview explains how it works in practice, and an artifact proves it was executed. When you can create that triangle, your conclusions become much harder to challenge. Beginners sometimes chase one strong-looking artifact and stop, but strong evidence is usually layered, not singular. Smart sampling starts with deciding what you are sampling, because you cannot sample everything in the same way. You might sample systems, locations, user accounts, firewall rules, change records, or vulnerability scan results, and each type has different risks. Sampling systems is often tied to build consistency, meaning whether systems are created and managed uniformly. Sampling locations is often tied to whether sites operate under consistent procedures and centralized controls. Sampling accounts is tied to whether account management is standardized and audited. Before you pick a sample, you should be able to explain what the population is, what makes it consistent, and what would make it inconsistent. If you cannot articulate those points, you are not ready to sample, because you do not know what could break representativeness. This is why a QSA spends time understanding the environment before deciding on sampling, even though sampling feels like an early planning step. The planning is informed by how standardized the environment truly is. A practical way to think about representativeness is to imagine what could be different inside the population that would change the control's effectiveness. If you are sampling servers for secure configuration, differences might include operating system type, role, location, hosting model, or administrative ownership. If you are sampling retail sites, differences might include network connectivity, local IT autonomy, hardware variations, or vendor support models. If those differences exist, your sampling plan has to account for them, because sampling only from one type would leave gaps. Smart sampling means you deliberately cover meaningful variations rather than selecting items randomly in a way that misses edge cases. It also means you avoid sampling only the easiest or most polished examples, because that creates a biased view of control effectiveness. Beginners often assume random selection is always best, but in assessment work, you often need purposeful selection to ensure coverage across key risk dimensions. The goal is not to prove the best-case scenario. The goal is to understand the real-case scenario. Now, let's focus on what makes evidence bulletproof, because this is where a lot of assessments become fragile, even when the technical controls are decent. Bulletproof evidence is evidence that is clear, specific, and directly tied to the requirement intent. Clear means a reviewer can understand what it shows without guessing. Specific means it relates to the exact system, process, or time period you are assessing, not a generic statement. Directly tied means it demonstrates the control is working, not just that someone planned for it to work. For example, a policy that says patches must be applied is not bulletproof by itself, because it shows intent. Evidence that patches were applied on a schedule, backed by change records and system state, is much stronger because it shows execution. Also notice that bulletproof evidence includes enough context to prevent misinterpretation, like identifying the system and the relevant time frame. If evidence is ambiguous, it invites doubt. The QSA mindset is to build a chain of proof that leaves little room for alternative explanations. Another element of bulletproof evidence strategy is handling exceptions honestly and transparently. In real environments, controls often work most of the time, but fail in specific cases, like a missed scan, a delayed patch, or a system that did not follow the standard build. Beginners sometimes hope those exceptions can be ignored as outliers, but outliers often matter because they reveal control weaknesses. A bulletproof approach does not hide exceptions, and it does not treat them as catastrophic by default either. It evaluates the impact of the exception, the reason it occurred, and whether it represents a systemic issue. If the exception is isolated and well managed, the evidence story can still be strong. If exceptions are frequent or poorly tracked, sampling becomes less defensible because you cannot assume consistency. The ethical and professional posture is to let evidence reveal the true state of control, even if it is not perfect. That honesty is what makes your conclusions defensible. Sampling also interacts with timing, which beginners often overlook. Evidence needs to match the assessment period and demonstrate that controls are operating consistently, not just at one moment. A screenshot or a single report might show a control exists today, but it does not necessarily show it was working last month or will work next month. This is why evidence strategies often look for records over time, such as logs, scan histories, change tickets, or review schedules. Sampling over time can be just as important as sampling across systems. For example, if you are evaluating a monthly review process, seeing 1 month of records might not prove the process is established. Seeing multiple cycles can. Your evidence strategy should align to the control's nature, meaning controls that operate continuously need evidence of ongoing operation, and controls that operate periodically need evidence across multiple periods. When you match evidence to control rhythm, you reduce the chance that you are fooled by a one-time compliance moment. A major mistake beginners make is treating evidence gathering like a scavenger hunt rather than a reasoning process. They collect lots of artifacts, but cannot explain how the artifacts prove the conclusion. Bulletproof strategy is the opposite. You start with the claim you need to support, then you choose the smallest set of evidence that proves it strongly, and you ensure that evidence is cross-checked. This makes your work more efficient and more defensible because your logic is clear. It also reduces noise, because too much irrelevant evidence can hide the important story and make reviewers suspicious. Think of evidence like building a case in court. A few strong pieces with clear connections are better than a pile of unrelated material. Another common mistake is relying too heavily on one type of evidence, like interviews or documents, because it feels easier. The QSA role rewards triangulation because it shows you verified rather than trusted. Smart sampling becomes most powerful when combined with clear rationale, because rationale is what transforms a sample into a defensible decision. Rationale means you can explain why the sample size and sample selection provide confidence, given the environment's consistency and controls. It also means you can explain what you would have done differently if the environment were less standardized. For example, you might say that centralized build management supports system sampling because systems are deployed consistently, while decentralized site management would require broader site coverage. You are not guessing, you are applying logic. This rationale also helps you respond to questions and challenges, because you can point to the reasoning rather than insisting your sample is correct because you chose it. Beginners sometimes feel nervous about being challenged, but a clear rationale makes challenges easier because you can discuss risk and representativeness calmly. In professional work, being able to explain your decisions is as important as making them. As you prepare for the exam, it helps to recognize that sampling and evidence questions often test whether you know what can and cannot be concluded from limited proof. You may see answer options that rely on a single artifact to make a broad claim, and those are often incorrect because they overstate certainty. You may also see options that refuse to conclude anything without inspecting every item, and those are often incorrect because they ignore practical assessment methods. The best answers typically reflect balanced judgment. Use sampling when justified by consistency. Choose evidence that demonstrates operation, and document rationale and exceptions clearly. Another pattern is that correct answers avoid trusting verbal statements without corroboration, because interviews are supportive but not sufficient. When you see these patterns, you can use them as a mental filter. Ask yourself whether the answer builds defensible confidence or whether it relies on hope. To conclude, smart sampling and bulletproof evidence strategies are about making the strongest possible conclusions with limited time by choosing representative subsets and layered proof. Sampling is only defensible when the environment is consistent and controlled, and when the sample covers meaningful variations rather than only easy examples. Bulletproof evidence is clear, specific, and directly tied to requirement intent, and it is strongest when it triangulates interviews, documentation, and observable artifacts. Timing matters because controls must be shown to operate over time, not just in a single moment. Exceptions are not something to hide. They are signals to evaluate honestly so your conclusions remain accurate. When you approach sampling and evidence as a reasoning discipline, you stop guessing and you start building assessment stories that hold up under scrutiny. This skill will support every later topic because the best scope decisions and the best reports are only as strong as the evidence behind them.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.